Welcome to Week 7's WDD 130 screencast. This will be addressing the finishing touches assignment. And as you see here displayed before you, we are implementing the grid display to associate a number of rows and columns with our work. Now, you don't have to use as many rows or columns to do yours, and I'll demonstrate I did mine within a 5x5 grid, but the wireframe does show that you're able to span columns that you designate, and you're able to span rows as you designate. So the rows are illustrated here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This example is using 8 rows. And how many columns? So the template calls for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. And you'll notice we can also identify a grid display in our footer and our header as well. So let's get to it. This is called the finishing touches assignment. You'll be laying out the home page using what we've learned with the CSS grid. So if you scroll on down, please make use of this link to review the wireframe. You'll see we will be implementing grid to create appropriate spacing. And I'll show you some of the tricks I did to finish this up. Again, if your code at the beginning from the getting started activity does not look like this, you're welcome to correct what you've done and create this home grid that we need to establish with the grid. Okay, this home grid is appropriately named because we will be targeting this class home grid to style our grid. So if you want to see mine, let's go take a look at it. Again, this is my index.html page. Okay, here's my div class home grid, and I have created some white space between my sections. I've got my home headline, paragraph 1, and home right image all nested here. And I've got my home left, home headline 2, and home paragraph 2 right here. And then down below, I've put in my home headline 3, paragraph 3 right here. And that's the come with us that you see. This is my home headline 3 and my paragraph 3, or home paragraph 3. And then below that, outside the main, I've established a footer. Okay, and I've created a social class div just to nest my social media images. Okay, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So those are all listed and illustrated here. To get them the size I wanted, I also established them to be 50 wide and 50 high. And yes, if we click on those, those should engage a redirect link to those social media websites. So you're probably wondering, how did I get this? Well, I learned to style this by following these directions here, really from steps 1 through, I think it's 14. And you want to make sure that you're targeting the selectors appropriately. So I'm going to actually just show you mine. If you go through the steps, you'll be able to establish these things as well. So let's just jump right to it. I'm going to show you my page, and this is how it looks in all of its glory. If I preview it, okay, notice the URL. It's index.html that I'm viewing. I can hover over my links. I've added a border, solid, 1 pixel border here around the logo image. I've spanned the width of my banner image. Let's go look at those. And how did I get these to nest nicely next to one another? I did deviate from the grid example for my unordered list and listed items because I honestly prefer to use inline for display up here. But I did resort back to grid with the footer social media icons. So let's look up here at the header. Let's check out what's going on. So if I come up to my index.html, I'll actually jump to my styles.css because that is where I'm doing all of my styling for the web page. So every single change that you see being affected here was done inside my styles.css. It's simply taking the shell of my markup commands and it's styled them with colors and borders and background colors and even fonts and images can be positioned with styles.css. So if we go in, at the top you'll notice I've imported a Google font called Lacquer. Okay, and that's what's displaying here. It almost looks a little creepy. Looks like it's been soaked in water. And you can see the Q and the R are kind of dripping liquid or paint. Even the W. And white water has that effect. So you can import a font if you'd like, and then to call the font with CSS, you identify the selectors. So in this case, I want everything in my body to incorporate Lacquer font. And as a backup, I've said sans serif. So that's what I've done there. Now let's look more closely at what I've done here. The CSS in my image has identified a max width for my images. Now if I had not declared this property, you'll notice I have some things going on over here now. It looks like my images are actually a little bigger. Okay, It looks like I've scaled them down by saying max width 100%. Perhaps I could have used an extra column over here that would have expanded my image, but I've decided to just give them all a max width of 100%. If I were to scale that down to 75%, you can kind of get the idea. Oh, so given its container or parent image or parent cell, if I only fill 75% of that width, it's going to cover this much. But if I extend that to 100% of the available space, it's going to span the page. We can also see here my banner box. I've also assigned a width of 100% for the image in my banner box. And if we look at the header, that is this whole area up here. I've actually incorporated display grid and a template of columns. Now I've identified this. Okay, if I look at this Dryor Image Rafting Company right here, that's the image. And if I wanted to get info, I could inspect it more closely. And I could say, well, how big is this image? If I look closely, can you tell? How big is the image? Does it show us? Well, can we open it up? Let's click here. It's looking like it's, how big exactly? Let's look at the sources. No, not console. Let's look at elements. Clicking here, clicking there. Let's actually do this. Let's also do this. Let's save image as. You can save the image. If you want to inspect it more closely, yeah, let's just save it to my desktop. Again, you can use this way to inspect elements or open it in Photoshop or any image editor to see it. So if I just want to throw it in here, let's say throw it in my desktop. Just click save, gotcha. And then I could come up here and show in folder. And I could just right click and you'll notice there should be a way to see the properties of the image. I can then open it up more closely and I can see, well, how big exactly is this? Does it show me those details? And indeed it does. It has a width of 250 and a height of 270. So that kind of helps me to know my Dryor image, okay, is about 250 and 270. So what I've decided to do is I've decided to open up my header with at least the first column representing 150 pixels. Okay, now could I extend that? Yeah, I could. I could expand this to be something like 250 pixels. But you'll notice, look what's happened. It seems I've already scaled my logo image to be smaller than the 250. So ideally what I've done is I've changed my logo already. So in its glory, it's 250, and that does look a lot larger. So how did this get so small? And I've probably made that change here in my div class logo box. And if we scroll on over, sure enough, that is where I've declared it to be 115 high and 115 wide. Okay, so essentially you can override things in the HTML even with inline properties for styling. And so that's why it is smaller than what you saw here. Okay, 250 by 270. So realize there's a lot of power with HTML, but you can also override things here. Okay, with CSS to a point. But essentially inline styling will override anything you do externally. Okay, so that's the reason for that. If we reduce that, you'll see, wow, that one column is just auto-filling the entire margin. Okay, we're saying one column auto-filled, but if I say, wait, what was it, 150 pixels for my first column? And then my second column is just going to auto-generate or auto-fill that remaining space. So that's how we do that. Now, if I look at home grid, that's all this area down here below the banner. You'll notice I've highlighted display grid. And I've created a template of columns. I say use all available space in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. And I've done the same with rows. Grid template rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. So I'm saying split it up into 5 equal areas. And whatever content I establish in those areas, just give it equal spacing. Okay, so equal spacing across the width of the page. So if you look at home headline 1 that I've established, I've decided to span the beginning of the column 1 through 4. And that took me about a little over most of this area with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. I'm spanning 4 of them. And realize the end of 5 columns is actually 6. If we come back to our layout here, if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, we call this 6 right here. Okay, so I'm spanning how much? 1 through 4 with headline 1. And that's what I'm doing here. And how many rows do I span? Is it 1 through 2 row span? Let's go check it. Yeah, it's grid column spanning 1 through 4, 1 through 2, and that's what I've done here. Okay, and just below that I have my home paragraph 1. And so I hope you start to see, as you start to span columns and rows, you're directly positioning all of the content therein. And if you want to even add things like padding top, see if I were to remove this, and this wasn't included in the directions, I've added this because what I found was if you give the elements home paragraph for this example and home headline the same grid row properties, they're going to run into each other, right? If I start at 1, okay, rather than start at 2, okay, they'll overlap. Now, I didn't like this whole gap that you see here, and yours will look like this if you follow the directions like exactly. So to override that issue, I thought, well, what if I start both of them at row 1? And then what if I added some padding, okay? What kind of padding? Well, in the direction of the top, okay? What if I added just padding to the top? Well, then that could push this down further. So you can override things with what you've learned with margins and paddings. You can also adjust the font size for these elements. And if you see, once you've highlighted something, you'll notice, hey, down here, I've actually given it 70 pixels. Okay, what if I did 20 to show you what happens? Well, it's still overlapping. Okay, I found 70 to be a nice little adjustment because I like to have a little more empty space below my paragraphs. Again, for the home right image, I've decided to start that column at 4 through 6, and I started at row 1 through row 3. And again, this is my home grid. I hope you're understanding that we're starting our grid here inside of div class home grid. So make sure in your styles.css you establish the boundaries for your rows and columns. That's super important. And if you omit the grid gap, this is what happens. Okay? If you omit it entirely, it just kind of squishes things a little more. So if you'd like a little more space, you can increase the EMs or emphasis points appropriately. So moving on down, you'll notice there's a headline 2 here and there's a paragraph 2. And just to show you what we've done with the instructions is we've just declared the columns we'd like those to span. I decided to go 3, 6 and rows 3, 5. And when I say 3, 5, kind of loosely, 3, the number before the slash is my starting point, and the number after the slash is my ending point. So if I say grid row 3, it means start at row 3, and then I say slash, that means continue until when? The ending point is 5. Okay, so it's going to end at 5. And that just means if I'm ending at 5, that means I should probably pick up come run with us at the beginning of 5. And indeed, it looks like I do that right here. I do pick up headline 3, where I've ended paragraph 2. I end at 5, well then I start the next row at 5 and continue through 6. And that's what I've done here. If I were to add an imaginary 7th row, okay, it's not going to do anything because my template did not establish a 7th row. I could just as well add a 7th row, okay? And then I'm going to get a whole bunch of empty space down here. So that's how it works. You essentially establish how many rows and columns you'd like to fill. And then down here, you target the individual classes for those elements or selectors, and you just assign them rows to begin and end at, and columns to begin and end at. As you see here, it'll just carry on. This is all accomplished, remember, through this wireframe. So visit this frequently. I've included links to it in the announcement. Make sure you use it as a reference. We've included this to help you finish your website. So please take advantage of the wireframe. As well, if you want to see my footer, because that can get a little difficult, you'll notice down here, I've included my footer at the base of my CSS just to show you. I've actually included a background that's white as well as a border. It's not necessary, but I wanted to tie in with the theme I have with the logo. And again, I've displayed grid for my footer, and I've displayed the template column. And I said, hey, let's allow this line of text to occupy 80% of my page. I could just as well change it. If you see 60%, it's going to occupy a little less. And then these social media icons kind of follow it, okay? Because I've decided to dedicate less space to those letters. If I fill up 80% of that area, well, it's going to give 20% of that area for the social media icons that follow. So think of different ways you'd like to style things. Use some simple math and calculate how much you want to occupy. And whatever's left over, remember, this is a very flexible unit. FR stands for flexible unit. It will take up whatever available space is left. So if you don't know what's left, just do 1 FR and it'll take up what's remaining. Think about using padding bottom, padding top if you want to mix things up. Also use the media query so that when you scale the page lower, everything will display in the block format. You'll notice here I have to adjust this because that's messing up with my padding. So I'll have to adjust that here. But go through, make sure you share your URL like so, and I look forward to seeing your work.